Hello everybody. Just want to do a quick run through of the physical properties and physical evidence lecture real quick for those of you who missed some of this, all of this, and of course the ending, which nobody has seen. So let me move through this quickly to save you from watching too much of this, which most of this should be reviewed. Right, we used physical properties as an important component of how to identify a substance that may be found at the crime scene and the different properties that it may have. So that led us to the metric system and how we measure things, and how it's much easier because all you have to do is move the decimal places, as we did in the measurement review lab. Temperature is another one that's very important. Knowing the boiling point, the melting point of certain substances can help you to identify a substance. Weight and mass are two different things. If you are physics students, you of course know this already, but if you haven't taken physics yet, just to give you an idea, your weight is actually a force that is being placed on the earth, which includes your mass times the pull of gravity. Density is a property that is used to identify certain pieces of evidence. We used it specifically in our class to look at glass. And the way we did that, as it shows here, is we recorded the mass, and then we used the water displacement method with graduated cylinders to get the volume, because glass is an irregular object and we couldn't just measure good old length, width, and height. And we did find in some cases it was an intensive property. An intensive property is something that's properties don't change no matter the size of the object. So a piece of glass can be whole or broken into a million little pieces, and they should all have the same density. This of course works with anything, just like a beaker of a solution should have the same property as a drop of that liquid from that solution. That's just what an intensive property means. Refractive index, all light travels differently through different types of media, like as you can see here, the difference between how light travels through water and air. That's another great way to determine properties of glass. So the two big ones that were just mentioned were density and refractive index, and how we measure glass. Glass is actually a very cool substance. It's not made of sand, at least not in the last like 200 years. It is a collection of the silicons and metal oxides, and depending on their use, there are different types. Things like Pyrex is what we'll find in our lab, because it can go from freezing to boiling and back without exploding like normal glass would. Tempered glass is very strong because of the way of its heat and cooling process. Some glass is also wire glass, where it has wire running through it, also very strong. Your vehicles are made up of laminated glass, where it is two sheets with a thin plastic film, and that of course is for your protection, so that when glass breaks, it will break into small little rectangles, not giant shards that could injure you. So thank goodness to the guy who invented laminated glass. We looked at glass fractures, how they're formed, right? They are force hitting something and it travels out in waves, but also it is putting pressure on the object that it is hitting, so it makes two different types of fractures. The radial fractures are kind of like when a rock hits a pond and it causes those waves. They are usually found in concentric circles around the outside. Well, not very circular, but they are found in the outside. And then of course the radial fractures, the ones that come out like rays, those are the ones that are formed from the force pushing against the substance. And so usually we look at glass for bullet holes. One of the things that we have discovered is the 3R rule, where radial cracks form right angles on the reverse side of impact. So if we're wondering which way the bullet came from, we can use the 3R rule to determine which way the bullet was traveling. Another helpful tip for glass is that glass fractures stop at pre-existing fractures. If you can see in this diagram, of course all these videos or all these slideshows are shared with you, but hopefully it's easy to see that this crack was pre-existing, and when this one bullet hole must have come second because it stopped at that point of impact. Another one that we haven't talked about completely is hair. Usually we do a bunch of labs where we look at hair and we use it for hair court cases and things like that. And so we get to see all the different parts of the hair, the cuticle right on the outside, cortex is the body, the medulla is the middle. Your hair is a bunch of fragments of skin that has been reassembled by your body, and so it looks as such. When we look at hair under the microscope, this is usually what we see, is whether you have a complete medulla, a fragmented one, or one that is completely absent. That is that black spot running down the middle. And so we would compare them. We can even tell if it's a horse hair or a cow hair. Sometimes you think you find some evidence and it turns out it's just your dog or a horse. Or it could be something cool like, hey, that means there's a black bear in the area. This is what a hair follicle looks like. Most of you have taken biology, and so you're familiar with the hair structure and how it builds it from the bottom up, just like grass grows. That's why you can keep cutting it off and it just keeps growing. I like this diagram because it kind of shows how the cuticle is the outer layer, the cortex is the main body, but there is often a medulla present. And there are a lot of fancy different medulla types that you can see. Now once we get into the roots, that's where we can actually get some evidence. The whole thing about hair evidence, which I think covers on this side, is that hair cannot completely link a person to a crime because it only contains mitochondrial DNA. And so that is not enough to convict a person on just hair evidence. But if you can get the root usually contains lots of body cells which are rich in DNA. So one of the nice things is if hair has been forcibly removed and you get a sample with roots, you can get a DNA sample, but just regular hair samples can only determine basic things like this, but that can also be pretty helpful when you're reconstructing the crime scene, right? This is the difference, right? Mitochondrial DNA found in the hair and the hair shafts. Down here, if you can pull the root out, you can get some nuclear DNA containing a full set. Another piece of evidence that is used to help is fibers. Fibers, of course, cannot be linked back to just one source because, of course, companies are trying to make a profit and they produce lots of fabrics on a large scale. So it can't be brought back to the individual, but it can be brought to the class evidence, which can help. There are two main types of fibers, right? The ones that are natural, that come from animal or plant sources, as well as man-made fibers, all of those nylons and dacrons and polyesters and things like that. Those are all what are called regenerated fibers and the synthetics because they have been made in a lab. So these are the different ways that we look at hair and fibers. We usually do a hair lab and a fibers lab where we look at the different types of fibers and patterns, where we look at fabric like wool, cotton, things like that. Hopefully we'll have time to do that. Last section in your physical properties is the paint section. Paint is a liquid, right? Dries onto a surface. It is just a suspension, right? It's a liquid suspension of all kinds of particles, pigments, additives, and it dries solid. As far as paint is concerned in forensic cases, it is almost always automotive. And what's nice about this is that automotive companies have their own patents on their own colors. And so when they are looking at certain types of paint that has been left on the scene of the crime, they can at least get it down to a class vehicles that could have that specific color, because each company like Ford and Chevy, they have their own patents on the colors. Of course, there are also people who have fancier paint jobs, which can then you can go to the individual source. But that's the big one for paint, is usually just in motor vehicles and car accidents. And so that's it for that unit. Tomorrow I will post a lecture on forensics toxicology, and we'll just move right on. We'll lump a couple of these together till I figure out how we can do a test and quizzing process. Hope all is well. We'll see you soon.